There are two different poleis. Remember, poleis is the plural for polis. Polis is not just a city-state, but it's also kind of the way of life and how Greeks see the world around them. There are two poleis that are really indicative of all other Greek poleis as a whole, and they're kind of extremes on two different ends, Sparta and Athens. So let's talk about Sparta first. It is on the south end of the Peloponnesus, so if you want to go forward a couple of slides and take a look at the next map that has Greece, or want to pull up the one from the last lecture, we're talking about the very southern peninsula. And originally it had been 5 different Dorian villages. Remember, those Doric Greeks come in and kind of initiate that Dark Ages. And these folks combined to create a Spartan state. One thing that's worth noting about our understanding of Spartans is that much of the information that shapes it doesn't come from Spartans themselves, but rather comes from outsiders. And a term that is often associated with Sparta because of this is the idea of the Spartan mirage. So in a mirage, you see what you want to see. If you're thirsty and you're in the desert, you see water, and it's a lot easier to see those things. The Spartan mirage is a term that was coined in the 1930s, and it suggests that we have a really exaggerated view of Spartans, and it's both in some ways kind of idealized, but also portrayed negatively. Spartans are seen as super militaristic, very heroic, but they're also seen as not really very artistic or active in trade. They're kind of idealistic disciplinarians on one hand, or unthinking followers on the other, and in reality that's not actually the case. You can see here, for example, that they had vast amounts of art. Their government was actually probably more representative than the one we see develop in Athens. And to flesh all this out, we've got to take a look at the sources that we do have. We know that in the 8th century BC, they conquered most of the people in that southern area, an area they called Laconia. And they set themselves up really as masters of that southern peninsula. As they did so, they also conquered people who had been there and incorporated them into their society, basically as slaves, people that were called helots, Helots. And these slaves become very much the basis of their economy. The job for all men is to do nothing but fight. Every single male in Sparta is a soldier. That means that if you're going to farm, if you're going to have a surplus of grain, excuse me while I make the dog stop fighting. Stop it. For the Spartans, they have to rely on a massive slave population to do that farming. That also means that the way they control those slaves is through their military, which means that if given the opportunity to rebel, it's often done very violently by these slaves. There's an individual that comes up a lot in Spartan history called Lycurgus. No one knows who he is, or whether he actually even lived, like a lot of the sources we've seen. But if he did, it was sometime probably around 800 BC. And why he's important to Sparta is he's considered their major legal reformer. And a bunch of writings are attributed to him that tells us how society functioned. So for example, children were judged by elders about whether they had something that could contribute to Spartan society or not. When children are born, they're taken to a group of individuals who look at them, assess them, and say, can they give something to the Spartan state or not? And if the answer is no, because they're premature, because they're deformed, they are excluded from Spartan society, and done so in a way where they're left outside and the elements kill these children, infanticide. We know from these writings as well that boys leave home at the age of 7. They're organized into troops and basically go to military school until they're about 18, at which point they live in military barracks. They fight from 18 to 28 or 30, and at the age of 30 they become citizens, they're allowed to marry, start a family, but even when they do that, they still sleep and they still eat with other soldiers. There is state education for girls. It's at home. Women there are actually probably better off than most other Greek poleis because they have more access to education, they have more focus on their physical development. Both boys and girls meet together for basic studies. They dance, they sing, not very Spartan in terms of what we might think. They play musical instruments. Greek relationships between the sexes in general are pretty stifled, not so much in Sparta. Um, and in terms of what women do, the role of women, if men are soldiers, women are really seen as individuals who create good children who promote the ideals of the Spartan state. So they create sons who are warriors. There's a great story that is probably not true, but it describes a big battle, and a woman has 4 sons, all of whom die, and basically somebody comes back to give her the horrible news, knocks on the door, says, "Ma'am, I'm sorry to tell you, all of your sons died." And her response is not to cry, but it's to ask, "Were we victorious?" So what we see here is an ideal in Sparta that everybody contributes to the state. And this is backed up by the fact that there's basic equality in land holding, that everybody who is a citizen, so a man of Dorian descent, can participate in government. They have a constitution that has 2 separate kings, but beyond that, they also have groups that are kind of like an oligarchy, and also elements of their government where every citizen participates. What they have is a government that is a republic. And later on, when folks in Rome are looking for an ideal model to base their government off of, they don't go to Athens. They actually go to Sparta because they think it's ideal. That's a lot on Sparta. We'll have a lot on Athens on the next slide, and then hopefully we'll kind of move a bit more quickly.